Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this fourth and final session of the Evangelical Convening on Immigration. My name is Walter Kim, and I'm the president of the National Association of Evangelicals. We connect and represent denominations, institutions, and ministries as we seek to glorify God in collaborative efforts to be an influence for the gospel. The issue of immigration is central to the NAE because we believe it's central to the heart of God. And as these sessions have explored, we believe that this is an expression of biblical faith that is so important for our moment. For this reason, the NAE is a founding member of the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is a coalition of denominations and organizations seeking to encourage a distinctly biblical approach to immigrants, both within our congregations and in terms of US immigration policy. Now, guiding the first part of today's conversation is Chelsea Patterson-Sobolek. Welcome, Chelsea.
Walter, thank you so much. As Walter said, I'm Chelsea Sobolek, and I am with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. I am our policy director here in Washington, D.C., but the ERLC is the policy and ethics arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention is the nation's largest Protestant denomination, and we represent about 45,000 congregations in the United States. And the issue of immigration and refugees is one that is very near and dear to our hearts, as Christians are on the front lines of caring for the immigrants and the vulnerable. Just as Walter said, we are one of the founding members of the Evangelical Immigration Table as well, and deeply care about this issue here in Washington, D.C. in our policy, but then in equipping our churches to care about this issue as well. So as we have talked about over the past few weeks on these sessions, immigration is a biblical issue, it's a ministry issue, it's a political issue, but it's also an economic issue. And that's the issue we're going to explore today with our panelists. For many Americans, their views on immigration are largely defined by whether or not they understand immigrants to be contributors to the US economy or a drain on the economy. So we're going to have a very honest conversation about that from a biblical perspective to equip you to have these conversations in your local communities and to understand this issue holistically. Our goal and our aim is to provide you all the resources and the tools you need to view the issue of immigration as holistically and biblically as possible. So our first panel is going to be on faith, work, and immigration. And our first panelist is Dr. Peter Crabb. He is a professor of finance and economics at Northwestern Nazarene University in Idaho. Next up is Jeff Hannon, CEO and Executive Director of the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. And then we have Dr. Enoch Hill. He is an associate professor of economics at Wheaton College in Illinois. And last but certainly not least is Danae Pierre. She is the executive director of the Surge Network in Arizona. Panelists, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you so much. Jeff, I am going to ask you the first question, and in these questions, I know my introductions of you all were very brief, but I think in these questions, you all will get to explore the organizations you represent a little bit more. But Jeff, you lead the Denver Institute, which a point of personal privilege. I've just been deeply impacted by the work that you guys do at that institute, but you guys there are focused on helping Christians to think in biblical ways about work and vocation. Can you give us a brief summary of how we should think about the idea of work as Christians and how that connects to the issue of immigration?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me again, Chelsea, today. So I'll give you just a brief overview of the Bible and work. So in the beginning, God created the world and he worked. Genesis 2 says that God himself was a worker and he created man to work. And Genesis 2:15, Adam is working in the garden. He is both doing some hard manual labor as well as intellectual labor of naming the animals. And in Genesis 3, we find that work is tainted and it is fallen and is broken. And that is the state in which we find work today. So God's people have an opportunity to come into that brokenness and bring them out of redemption to that. As it relates to this conversation today, a major reason that immigrants move, of course, is work. They come for various reasons, but I'm thinking actually of two people that I know. One is my friend Robin John, who started a company called Eventide Funds. His parents brought him to the United States from India as a child, and now Eventide Funds manages $6 billion of value for their shareholders. I also think of somebody actually in this offices right here who cleans these offices. His name is Juan. And he came too, and he's got all of his kids back in Mexico. And he is looking for ways to contribute not only to the economy, but to contribute for his kids as well. And so as I think about the Bible and immigration, even just broadly, immigrants are everywhere. Abraham was an immigrant. Moses, God's people, the Israelites were immigrants. And I think what's important as we even start this conversation about the Bible and work and immigration is immigrants are continually grouped with vulnerable categories and vulnerable people. And we see that today. When you're far away from home, I lived in Ecuador for a year. I was tall, I was white, I didn't fit on the subway system at all. I felt out of place. I needed people to welcome me in. So that concept of welcoming the stranger, I think, is very important as we think about the Bible, immigration, and work.
Jeff, thank you so much for that helpful introduction. I want to kick another question over to you, but what does the Bible, a little bit more broadly, what does the Bible say about the issue of immigration? As we're digging into this topic, can you just give us a brief biblical overview on that?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So immigrants are everywhere in the Bible, right? Abraham is called out of Ur. Moses is an immigrant into Egypt. We see that even in the Old Testament, immigrants, the Israelites are actually seen as, you were once immigrants in Egypt. So when you are now back in the promised land, you are to treat immigrants as they are yourself, because you were once immigrants, right? Jesus himself was a refugee in Egypt. Jesus chooses a foreigner, a Samaritan, as the hero of his story. That Jesus says, hey, when you welcome the stranger, you welcome me, in Matthew 25. So the immigration issue, immigrants are everywhere in the Bible, as well as Romans 13, is that we need laws, that laws need to be obeyed. And I think the real disconjointedness of our current legal system with actually laws that bring about the common good is something that we need to talk about today too. But yeah, I can actually drop in the chat feature. We did a little 9-minute Vimeo video of just scripture verses that mention the foreigner, and this could potentially be helpful for somebody to think, what does the Bible say just about the foreigner in the Old Testament, the ger? What does that mean, and what does that mean for our church or our congregation? I'd be happy to drop that in.
That'd be great. And just as a reminder to our participants, there is a question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions, please drop those in there and we will get to those as we continue. But Dr. Crabb, I am going to come to you now. Can you help us think about this issue from an economic perspective? Jeff gave a great biblical overview on the issue of immigration, but can you help us understand this from an economist perspective? Maybe give us a big picture summary of how you think about the economic impact of immigration on the United States.
Very good. Thank you, Chelsea, and thanks for allowing me to be here. Yes, when we look at this question from economic research standpoint, or we look at the research on this question in economics, the categories or the studies generally fall into two categories. So the first primary question, or usually it's an argument against immigration, is that migrants displace the native workers in the labor market, or thereby lower their wage. And so the second question is brought up in this research with regards to social tensions that arise with immigration, but that's not really an economic question, even though it gets into this economic research and literature as well. So first, to the first question, empirical studies find only a limited effect on migration and average wages in employment of native workers. So there's not evidence that it's really hurtful in one way or another. It's a very limited effect. Giovanni Perri at UC Davis has done a lot of work on this, and so I would point people to his research on that. Going back to the second argument that comes up, that so migrant workers or migration into the labor market has been associated in general with social tensions due to the differences in culture. Like Jeff was saying, he stood out because he's tall, you know, and just these social tensions and differences. So David Card at Berkeley has done a lot of work on this, and he particularly has found in his research that when you ask people about migrants, it's not always the economic issues that they bring up. They're really concerned. They bring up safety issues. They bring up, you know, rule of law questions and those, although they tie it into this economic research for it. But that's only one part of the research. And so the broader research looks at the primary channels or ways at which the migrant, the immigrant has a positive impact on the prosperity or the economy as a whole for it. And so economic theory says that there are a number of ways that migrants actually help the workforce. First of all, they increase the labor force population. Migrants are coming to work, as Jeff said, and that's going to actually increase the overall labor market. So that they're a working age population when they're coming in from it. But they can also, you know, bring higher labor productivity through a number of channels. If you think about the migrant first, they're taking a risk. So immigrants tend to be less risk averse than others in the labor market, and that's why they're entrepreneurial. They start new businesses. So that's a key thing that immigrants bring to the labor market, and a key part of encouraging overall greater labor productivity. But also they bring complementary skills along with them. So the labor market benefits and employers benefit from different skills that native workers don't find. And then finally, they could improve overall labor productivity just by encouraging the native workers to be better at what they do. When this new worker that comes into the market, that they're actually perhaps competing. I was hesitant to use that word, but perhaps competing against that worker. So getting to that question, overall labor productivity, the International Monetary Fund has published a lot of research on this. And the most recent one I've looked at, they studied 18 different countries and the migration effects to labor productivity. And they found that a 1% increase in the share of migrants in the workforce actually increases GDP per capita output by 2%. So there's clearly a positive economic impact. And the questions that arise really should, if it's going to be about economics and not these other issues that I mentioned earlier, we really have to look at labor productivity as that result. So yeah, I'll provide in the chat room some links to the research I just mentioned.
That's extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that overview. And it sounds like we have a lot of material to share with our attendees. I did want to acknowledge that we are working on getting Danae on. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but we're going to roll with the punches here. Dr. Hill, I have a follow-up question for you. Can you share maybe some of the trends in the past 5-10 years on the issue of immigration and economics, and maybe some of the trends that have led, you know, immigrants here, and what that's looked like, you know, kind of trend-wise over the past 5-10 years?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad the conversation's taking place. Also, one aspect I did want to add on to the great overview that Peter provided us with is that often when we think of migration, we think of immigration, which is the effects on the recipient or the country of destination. There's a nice paper by Michael Clemens in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which really highlights that that's only one part of the story. So if we think about trade, we've kind of, you know, global views on trade have been shifting possibly in a negative direction more recently. But even if all barriers to trade were removed, the range of estimates in the literature is that would increase global welfare, global GDP at least, by just a couple percentage points. If we think about the total available benefits by opening all borders, the total economic benefit would, the range of estimates in the literature are 60 to 150% of overall GDP. So the global benefits are astounding. The question we want to be really thinking about is who is we? Who do we identify? Do we care about global poverty? Do we care about domestic poverty? Do we care about the plight of the migrant themselves? Second, there is agreement in the discipline. So the one thing, there is agreement in general that on net, just like Peter mentioned, the benefits to the recipient country are on net positive. The question is, how are those distributed? And I realize I'm not answering the follow-up question you gave. So I'll switch tacks, but there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about here.
And that's helpful. I'm glad you added that on.
Great, thanks. So what are some trends more recently? I guess we're probably focusing domestically. There's been huge trends in Europe with the migration patterns shifting pretty dramatically over there, which is where I'd say things are changing most dramatically. But in the US, there's a couple of, we can think of the motivations of migration. So some of these motivations are economic. I see the possibility of a brighter future or the ability to provide for my family. They also may be a push mechanism, a feel of danger or a lack of safety from the country of origin. So there's different motivations for migration. And a last thing to recognize is, at least globally, migration is pretty small. Like, these are a very select group of people. So that of the global population, only 3% of the global population is living in a country that they weren't born in. Which means within the US, it's a much higher percentage of foreign-born people living in the US, I believe roughly around 14%, but I'm pulling that out of my head. So I might check my facts. I know that it's much higher, but it's still like this is a select group who's demonstrated by their willingness to leave what's familiar, what is a culture that they're comfortable with family that they're comfortable with, etc. That they have a strong motivation to move, and perhaps that they're willing to take some risks for that reason. So we recognize there's already been some significant disruption when somebody chooses to pick up and move to a new location. So maybe that's just some initial thoughts.
That's very helpful. And I was just informed that we have Danae on the phone. Danae, are you with us? I think she just hopped on, so we'll give her a second to join. But Jeff, I'm gonna ask you a question. Danae, do we have you?
Yep, I'm here.
Wonderful. Hi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Sorry about that.
Of course. Jeff, I'm gonna kick a question over to you, and then Danae, I have some questions for you as well. But Jeff, can you speak to maybe some of the misconceptions around the roles of immigrants in the economy?
Oh gosh, I had the mute thing on. At our company, when you talk with the mute on, you owe $1, the mute jar. I don't know if you guys do that. Our mute jar is getting pretty big. Yeah, let me actually talk about that from a couple examples. I am mostly in circles that, especially in my family, that immigrants, it's a very tense word. And there's a lot of feeling of almost threatening, I would say, that it comes up. And I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is the question of identity. So for the Christian, the identity is founded in being God's child. It's founded that right there, right? And so our national or ethnic identity comes behind actually being founded there. And so when we get to things like immigrants are stealing our jobs, right? There is actually a real identity question there that actually goes before an economic one, where sometimes economic arguments actually can't push through because I feel so threatened and so angry right now. I think the Christian faith can actually help this tremendously by saying we are secure in who we are as God's people, and that allows us to invite in the other and to start having conversations, right? And to say that they're taking our jobs, there's, I think, a theological argument, and I'll let the economists go to the economic argument, which actually a good percentage of jobs created by Silicon Valley was actually the immigrants actually doing that work. So we can get to that as well. But I actually think those types of things, they need to be talked about from a place of comfort and maybe not comfort, but a place of being secure in who we are, even before we can actually get to some of those immigration issues. And then I'll let Danae take it because she has a better perspective than I.
I just want to say I'm so glad you brought that up, because words matter, and words, as Christians, we ought to be so very careful about the words we choose to say and not to say. So I'm really glad you brought that up. Danae, welcome. We are so glad you're here. You run a network called the Surge Network, and that has guided many pastors and lay people in Arizona through what you call the Faith, Work, and Rest Initiative, which I love that title. But can you tell us more about what this is and why you think it's an important theme for Christians?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've really focused on as a network of churches the last 12 years has been really wanting to reorganize our local churches around discipleship in all areas of life. And just realizing that the workplace is a place that, our work and our lives can so easily be segmented from our faith, and integrating our faith into our work is really important. And not just in the ways in which we want people to show up to work and have, be hard workers and have good Christian character. Like, that is really important. But we also really believe that God has placed Christians in various locations in various parts of our city to be a restorative presence, to help bridge and participate in reconciliation, and seeing how different ways that we've been gifted, or just occupations that God has placed us in, are all ways that we can really point to the new kingdom, the new heavens and new earth, and then just also realizing that is something that some of us are able to choose vocations that really align with passions, and others are in situations that have a lot of justice issues. Some are able to really benefit from a lot of freedom vocationally, and others have a lot of restrictions. And we've just really felt like it's our calling as God's people to really collectively care about what's happening across our city, across all different sectors and industries.
So, Danae, in Arizona, roughly 1/5 of all the workers in Arizona are immigrants. What are some of the ways that you have seen churches and Christians serve on the front line as they've been learning about the issue and serving the immigrant community there?
Yeah, I think there's a few different things. One, I think we've really been convicted this last 10 years of just some of the ways in which maybe the average kind of evangelical church can really elevate and even idolize certain vocations and work, and then really kind of have attitudes or opinions about other types of work, particularly work that ends up being done but that are significant ways of service to our city. So, hospitality and, labor that involves, physical labor, construction, agriculture, that a lot of these vocations are really looked down upon. And I think there's been a strong conviction to say that the reality is our city is held together by a force of people who are laboring in ways that provide a lot of service to the community and provide a lot of stability. And it really then matters that we are active in seeking the best work situations for people, as well as really understanding the different challenges that our neighbors go through. So I think there's actually been an emphasis placed on vocations and occupations that have often been overlooked or kind of dismissed as less important. And we've done a lot of work with thousands of people now to help them really actively think about all the different ways that we are blessed by all types of work, and then what is our responsibility then to ensure that there are just and equitable ways for families to flourish.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think it's something so important to cast a broader vision and intent for what work looks like, and how we can all participate in that. I'm going to open this question up to anyone who wants to answer it. I think you all have something very important to this, and we've picked up on this thread a little bit already, but immigrants contribute in very significant ways in the economy, but the belief of everyone being created in God's image also means that dignity and worth are inherent. They're not based on how we participate in the economy or what we do. So what are some ways that we can best talk about immigrants in the economy without maybe casting an unbiblical view of people and the value we might assign to them based off of their participation in the workforce? So Dr. Hill, I'm gonna kick this question over to you first, but then please, other panelists, I'd love your input as well.
I love this question. It's great. I work at Wheaton College, which is a liberal arts institution, and as part of the liberal arts, we recognize that we each have a unique perspective to bring to the conversation. I think so often the conversation on immigration is immediately cast in economic terms, which misses perhaps the most important part, which we are talking about other human beings who are, like you said, made in the image of God. And so the economic considerations are important because we do each presumably earn a living in one way or another, but it's not the central part of the conversation. And so I think one thing we can regularly be doing is asking, how do we bring economic conversation alongside these other aspects and make sure that we're not missing, how do I effectively love my neighbor? How do I care for the people that I come into contact with, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's a really important question and calls to mind, to the forefront, that we always need to be casting any economic conversation, the broader conversation of how do you love the other.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that and perhaps piggyback off of what Jeff was saying with regards to the biblical understanding of work. And so the question about economics is with regards to labor productivity, like I mentioned before, the output of my work. But that's not the only reason we work. And we need to bring the conversation into work as a vocation and work as a calling and work as a service, no matter what the level of productivity for it. So everything we have, this technology that we're currently speaking over, is essentially not a product, but a service. It's the labor of people that put together, it's their ideas and their different talents that they brought to the table, to use that metaphor again here. So it's the economic question is much broader, as Enoch said, about the person itself, but also the economic question gets put aside a little bit more if we realize that we're talking about life here and what we do, and if we would get a better understanding of the value of work itself, and everything's a service, then the economic questions, the economic discussion would go much easier.
Yeah, thanks for that, Peter. Let me just add something briefly to that. Yeah, one economic and one biblical argument. The biblical argument, I think, is that there is enough. There is enough in God's economy. Like economy comes from oikonomia. I have a friend that leads a thing called the oikonomia network. It's a household, God's household. So in God's household, there actually is enough for everybody. You get this idea of abundance, that there doesn't have to be the scarcity mentality, right? So with that thinking, again, there's not enough and I have to grasp on, that's not the biblical worldview, is that God will provide. Actually, he just says, look, trust me, if the lilies of the field look like that, I will take care of you. And whether that be for poor immigrant friends, wealthy immigrant friends, or citizens, there is enough to that. So I think it's an important thing to think about this enoughness inside of the biblical worldview that then actually takes a look at economics and saying there's a thing called wealth creation, right? You can actually create wealth in a business structure. You can sell it for this, much and it costs this much, and you create wealth and now there's more jobs, right? It's kind of economics 101. But that has to come from a place of there is enough. I can invite in others, we can hire, we can grow and build. And the American economy has been doing that well for a long time. So I think we need to think about that.
Can I jump in? There's one more thing that came to
Absolutely.
mind. I think that I think this actually harkens back to what Jeff brought up earlier, that it might not actually be the economics that is the main sticking point for people who are standing against legislation in favor of expanding legal immigration. So, for example, in general, the economics are overwhelmingly positive with respect to immigration. The disagreement, to the extent that it exists, is a relatively small group of workers. Is there a negative effect on wages for this small group of workers? On the whole, it's positive. And yet the median voter in almost every survey I'm aware of is not in favor of expanding the legal immigration. So to the extent there's a sticking point, we actually have to be digging deeper and saying, like, what are the reservations? And I think that involves that involves listening to everybody, including listening to people who might disagree with your position or another's position, is trying to understand, like, who are you? Where are you coming from? Where are your concerns? Because I think there are a lot of, Chetty has just shown, a pretty famous economist has just shown that the percentage of Americans who are living at a higher living standard than the previous generation is fallen pretty dramatically. And so there are tensions that are existing. They probably aren't coming from immigration, but there are tensions. So there's probably real pain that's occurring, and we need to listen to those things too and figure out if it's not just economics that we're talking about.
I'm so glad you made that point. Danae, anything to add on this point before we move on?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we've discovered in a lot of our work, when we begin to educate and equip local churches, we'll bring people together at tables where they're sitting and having meals with families who are immigrants and sharing stories. And one of the things that's really stood out to me as we debrief the whole process with churches, with the people who participate, is that there really are a lot of emotions and opinions that have been formed over the years that really aren't necessarily rooted in the reality around the economy. And so I do think that, taking the time to peel back those layers and really giving people the space to explore what are their concerns, why aren't they, even in light of the benefits to the overall nation or the overall city, where are these concerns coming from? A lot of church members that we've worked with have never taken the time or space to really name them and locate them. And so then it's hard to move past that in order to really educate on some of the realities related to the economic side of it.
That's why I think these types of conversations are so important, because we can go a little bit deeper than what you might hear on cable news or something like that. Dr. Hill, another question for you. This came up in our question and answer box, but how would you answer the question? If someone says, "Well, immigrants are just a drain to our social welfare system," how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so it is a pretty salient question on most people's minds. So if you want the numbers, in the U.S., it's actually not entirely clear. So immigrants pay into a lot of forms of taxes that they don't receive benefit from. The most commonly referenced one is Social Security. They also draw down in ways that may or may not, on net, be beneficial or harmful. From what I gather in terms of like after reading several papers on the topic, it seems to be the case that there's probably a slight negative effect overall on the welfare system, total cost versus benefit. But that's not the interaction that we all have collectively. So like, if we think, are there enough jobs? Well, the U.S. population has grown dramatically since the United States was founded, and there has always been enough jobs in terms of roughly a stable amount of the population has been unemployed and has been employed. And so it's not like whether there's enough or there's not enough. immigrants bring additional skills to the economy. They demand additional goods and services, and they provide additional products. If they're providing them, if wages are lower, that means they're probably providing them at a lower price than we would have otherwise been able to enjoy. Additionally, a disproportionate amount of entrepreneurship tends to occur within immigrant populations. And the reasons are kind of, or in my opinion, I think they're kind of apparent. I was saying that only 3% of people in the world live in a country they weren't born in. These are risk takers, people who are willing to put everything up in the air for a belief that there might be a better future. And these are the same types of people who are willing to put themselves at great risk by starting new businesses. And while big companies employ most of the population, most job growth occurs within these smaller businesses. So there's a lot of benefits to be discussed beyond just the welfare system.
Thank you so much. So we are wrapping up this session before I hand it over to Dr. Kim for his session, but I'm going to pose one more question and allow everyone to answer this, and we'll start with Jeff. But what one big takeaway do you want our audience to have on this discussion on the economy and immigration? Jeff, over to you.
Yeah. My one big takeaway is, let's please frame this in terms of the biblical narrative before we do politics or economics. That's my one big takeaway. I encourage you to think, research, to think about the world that's presented in the Bible first, before we then come into politics and economics. I think it flows well when we start there.
Dr. Crabb?
Sorry, a little slow on the mute button. Yeah, the big takeaway from studying economics is that this is not really an economics question. And I think that's what somebody that sits down and looks at the data and looks at the economic studies that have been done will find themselves getting to the real issue, whether in their heart or the real issue that they're talking to about someone else.
Dr. Hill?
I'm going to steal from the wisdom of the other two and say, first of all, the economic results are pretty minor in terms of impact for the recipient country. They can be major for the migrant. So this could be a major improvement to the life and welfare of the migrant. And then the bigger question is, like, if there is a 1% cost, am I willing to sacrifice so that somebody can have a much improved life? And I think, so how do we love neighbor? It ought to be the forefront question, rather than like, is there a slight decrease or increase in a specific number?
And today?
Yeah, I think I always like to kind of bring it back to proximity. Who are the immigrants in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and in what ways are they at risk because of policies that have not been able to, because of not being able to advance on reforms and policies, and that we would just really think about what it means to love our neighbors and the justice and equity side of it first, and then from that, economics, politics could be something that we unpack. But as Christians, our primary calling is to think about what it means to love our neighbors and care sacrificially, that in the kingdom of God, there is enough, there's an abundance for all. And so let's be on the forefront of modeling that and how we show hospitality and advocate alongside of these neighbors who really contribute to the richness and beauty of what becomes our cities or neighborhoods.
Well, panelists, thank you so much. Each one of you contributed so much to this discussion, and I am so grateful that you have cast such a beautiful vision of what the Bible says on this topic, and of what God's economy says on this topic, and how there is more than enough for all of us, and how each one of us is created in God's image and has such a beautiful and valuable role to play in the kingdom of God. And I love that each one of you hit on the point that God's commandment is for Christians is to love him and love our neighbor. And we can do this so well through discussions like this, through going out and loving loving our neighbor. So thank you so much for what you said. And Dr. Kim, I am turning it over to you.
Thank you. This has been very informative, a rich discussion up to this point. We've encountered studies and large concepts that have really framed very well the economic factors that exist, the challenges that exist, opportunities, as well as a realistic view on net impacts. And we've also explored biblical principles that ought to shape our thinking on the matter of immigration. We're going to shift gears in this second section, but I want to provide a reminder that today's session is a part of a larger set of stimulating discussions. And we're not going to be able to answer every question. And if you've missed any of the first three sessions of this year's Evangelical Convening on Immigration, you can find the recordings of each of the sessions at the link that's posted at the chat. You'll see that. And we'll also be posting the recording of these conversations in the next 24 hours, particularly with the links that you will find very helpful of the studies and other issues that have been brought up. So as I mentioned, this first segment, we've looked at the broad economic concepts, the biblical principles. We're in this second section going to look at some of the practical outworking in specific industries. And with us, we have Nancy Chan of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Mark Grace of Baylor, Scott and White Health, John Erb of Roy Farms, and Mark Espinoza of Walmart. I would invite each of our panelists, when you answer a question, to provide a little bit more detail of who you are and your work at your various businesses and organizations. So you represent four industries: technology, healthcare, agriculture, and retail. And we've all relied on you in some very unique ways through this pandemic. The country, I think, has very much recognized just how essential the frontline work that you are doing is for us, whether it's feeding us or keeping us clothed, whether it's the technology that connects us, and certainly the healthcare challenges that confront us. But it's not always obvious that many of the essential work that's being done is done by immigrants. So I'd invite you to share a bit about the role that immigrants play within the workforce of your company or industry. And let's begin with Nancy.
Hi, everyone. Just to share a little bit about myself and where I work. So I work at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is the tech company started by Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan as part of their private philanthropy. So basically, Chan Zuckerberg both has a technological component where we create a lot of technical products that are supposed to create a better future for everyone. And then we also make grants to different organizations in criminal justice, immigration, housing, science, and education. I also based in Silicon Valley. I've also had actually for college. I was just saying, yeah, I've been an immigrant myself. I just became a US citizen 2 years ago, but was on a number of visas, work visas, on H-1B. I was on a religious workers visa when I worked for the Navigators as a campus minister. So I'm personally familiar with the immigrant story, but also have seen it played out in Silicon Valley. And as other people have mentioned, immigrants have played a really key role in founding a lot of the companies in the Valley. First or second generation immigrants have founded almost half of the tech companies that are on the Fortune 500. We do have, I know that people always talk about shortages of highly skilled tech workers, and that is true. We really do have a shortage of experienced technologists. And I think people don't understand, like, employers, it's really, really hard to hire foreign nationals. You have to pay several $1,000s to, apply for H-1B visa. To sponsor someone for green card takes years. And basically it's an incredibly burdensome process and risky because there's a quota, in H-1Bs. I think right now it's about 85,000 H-1B visas per year. So it's not an easy undertaking. And I really think employers like Facebook and Google only really undertake it if they find the talent, and they just have to do it. And as someone who was a foreign national myself, I had a lot of barriers to finding jobs because a lot of employers didn't want to employ me because of all of these hassles of having to go through work visa processes. I just want people to understand there's a real significant barrier that employers have to incur. And I do want to acknowledge, though, there in every system there is exploitation in some form. And for large high-tech companies, this is not the case, but with H-1B, there is a small portion where they have hired, cheap software engineers to work at these outsourced companies. And that is a reality. It's not a huge phenomenon, but it does happen. So I just want to acknowledge that, there are articles written about it. And I think to just overlook it is to be disingenuous. So that does happen. But I know that in large tech companies, when we hire, it's genuinely because people add value and bring skills that we cannot find on the labor market otherwise. And there's a real cost to hiring foreign nationals. So that's all I'll share for now.
Thank you, Nancy, very much. Why don't we hear from you, Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Grace. I'm the Chief Mission and Ministry Officer for Baylor Scott & White Health. I've worked with that organization for 33 years total. My own story begins at age 9, though, when in Copperas Cove, Texas, I was encouraged to take Spanish. And that was at the same time, I'm not going to tell you what year it was, but it was at the same time that kids in South Texas, specifically in Crystal City, were being punished for speaking Spanish. So somehow or other, I landed up in a school district that was rather enlightened. And the thing that stuck in my brain, aside from just this instant love for languages, was that I was going to need to speak Spanish. El ser bilingüe vale por dos. To be bilingual is to be twice as valuable. And I found that in my life. And then at age 15, I began going to the Rio Grande River, eventually was a Rio Grande River minister, volunteer, worked there all during college, and began pastoring Hispanic churches in seminary. I got into healthcare, and to make a long story short, when I was hired as director for Legacy Baylor Healthcare System, which is part of Baylor Scott & White Health, my one condition was that we do multicultural education. And so we've helped immigrants, close to 24 immigrants over the 26 years I've been to become citizens. And we've conducted what we call culturally balanced units of CPE, where at least half of the participants were from outside the dominant culture. And some of that was very practical. You know, obviously a lot of it had to do with what I've received from immigrant communities my whole life. But some of that had to do with just the awareness for me as a young chaplain of translating for many, many people. I didn't think we're getting the best healthcare possible because they didn't have advocates. And as a chief mission and ministry officer, so Baylor Scott and White Health, we've focused on through a program called Faith Community Health on serving underserved communities and at-risk communities. So my wife and I live in West Dallas. We're proud. You can look up what West Dallas is, but we're proud citizens of West Dallas. Very grateful to be here. And so my life has just really been involved with so many of the biblical principles that people have talked about here. In healthcare right now, you know, we're just overwhelmed. And part of the overwhelm has been what I would call the incredibly unfortunate impact of the way that we treat immigrants. If you want to start at the top, the way we treat physicians who are immigrants. There's a great video by Michio Kaku, by the way, on the secret of the H-1B and how that's kept our economy afloat. But doctors threatened by their patients, nurses having to endure the worst kind of racial abuse, patient aids and patient checks. So my time is coming up now, but there's that segment of it. And then the other segment that we've worked really hard at through Faith Community Health and through our own programs in underserved communities to help largely immigrants to get jobs in healthcare has really been about what so many people have talked about before. The organization I work for is a Christian Ministry of Healing, and it's part of our non-negotiable. That's been a long, decades-long conversation that if we don't take care of everybody, we might as well not take care of anybody. And that social determinants of health are real. They impact people from the very top to the very bottom. And one of the beautiful developments, at least in my small corner of healthcare that I've seen over the years, is an increasing awareness and willingness to understand that if we help people to get jobs, to have reliable, sources of food in their neighborhood, to get healthcare, basic healthcare, that the health of the whole city improves. And of course, in the age of COVID, that's becoming achingly apparent. Is that if we don't extend healthcare to everybody, then we might as well not take care of anybody. That's a little extreme, but it's the way I feel about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Nancy and Mark, we will have many other issues to come back to you, but I'd love to hear from John Erb at this point.
Good morning, everyone. My name is John Erb. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Roy Farms. We produce tree fruits, blueberries, and hops in the Yakima Valley up in Washington. I've been in agriculture since the 90s. I've spent a tremendous amount of time in Latin America. I spent about 7 years living in Brazil. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and I've worked a lot on labor issues, as that's one of the big, let's say, resource constraints within agriculture in the United States today, but really it's an issue around the world. And so when you get into immigration laws, policies, and what have you, it's a big deal, as you all know. I will say, as far as essential workers, or what do immigrants mean to the agricultural sector, basically without immigrants, access or affordable access to fresh fruits and vegetables would be extremely limited. Just a few details with regard to what's been happening over the last, let's say, decade. There's been a huge spike in terms of guest workers. And so they're coming over on the H-2A visa. And so the numbers about tripled over the last decade. In 2019, there was approximately 258,000 guest workers, which represents about 12% of the agricultural workforce. And so just to kind of highlight a few things about that, of why that's so significant as it pertains to the farmers that are trying to bring their crops in. They really do not want to bring guest workers just purely from a financial perspective. They have to pay what's called the adverse wage, which is basically a law that intends to protect local wages. So in the state of Washington, for example, it's $15.83 per hour is the minimum rate, whereas the minimum wage in the state of Washington is $13.69. So right from the front, the farmers have to pay $2 more per hour just as a base rate. Not only that, they have to pay for housing. So it's not just subsidized and that kind of thing. They actually have to, a federal mandate is that you actually have to provide the housing. The farmer has to pick up the transportation costs to bring people in the country. They're paying for the visas. Oftentimes they're reliant on farm labor contractors, and so there's fees associated with that. So essentially, the farmers really do not want, there's a very strong reason to not bring in guest workers just purely from a financial perspective. And yet you see a tripling of that number over the last decade. So that's very telling, because they would not do that if there was a plentiful workforce locally. The farmers also, in terms of their experience, and I've been on over 1,000 farms in my career, so I've talked to a lot of farmers. They oftentimes you see kind of a generational workforce, for lack of a better way to put it. But oftentimes folks that have kind of grown up on the farm, let's say, that have had different tasks from harvesting a crop, just basic field labor. Many of those folks are now managers on those farms, and there's just a tremendous amount of loyalty and connectedness and that type of thing on many of the farms. And so many growers, have just a tremendous tie with the people that are working on their farms, and they're kind of part of the family, so to speak. So, from an agricultural perspective, and from a farm, let's say a grower perspective, immigrant labor, as we call it, is really much more than that. These are people that just have a tremendous amount of impact on the farms, and in many ways, both from just bringing the crop in to being reliant on many levels throughout the organization. So.
Thank you. So we've heard from technology, we've heard from the healthcare sector, we've heard from agriculture, and Mark Espinoza. What's the perspective from retail?
Walter, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be on this. It's interesting, Mark Grace, when you opened your comments, I actually grew up in Crystal City, Texas. So that community that you talked about, that was home for me, and it still is home for me. But I work for a small retailer called Walmart, and with 500 stores and around 1.5 million associates nationwide, Walmart is proud to serve all of America. My job here has evolved a number of different times here at the corporate office, but I have the opportunity to work on some of our work around immigrants integration. As a global company, we operate in 26 countries, so naturally our workforce reflects that of the communities we serve. Couldn't tell you exactly how many people from other countries work at Walmart here in the US, but I can tell you that with the size of our workforce being similar to that of a medium-sized city, the number of foreign-born individuals that are authorized to work that we employ is on par with the national average. So at Walmart, we're on a journey towards inclusion, and as we strive to be the most trusted retailer, we're constantly evolving how we do things to make life better. That evolution is not just about our stores, though. If you think about retail industry as a whole, including suppliers, and John can attest to this, we have manufacturers, agriculturists, logistics, supply chain, technology, A shared value approach to problem solving is a competitive advantage for us all, especially with the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion is applied. So responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and continuing to serve our customers in new and exciting ways has been a test of our company's strength and capabilities. Walmart associates have done their jobs valiantly during these unprecedented times, so we're doing everything we can to help ensure the health and well-being of our associates and customers. That includes keeping everyone updated and informed. Not only have our associates continued to serve the nation through this pandemic, our pharmacists and pharmacy staff have played a vital role supporting COVID-19 testing since April 2020. These efforts are no small feat, and let me assure you, but Walmart associates, whether they were born in the US or not, stand ready to serve. And so we always are looking for a workforce that mirrors that of our customers. And so when you have an immigrant workforce that understands the cultures, the purchasing, the language, it's a better way of serving your communities in the areas where they need the most.
Thank you for these perspectives. It's been very helpful. Each of you have described some very powerful personal experiences of what has informed you, whether it is actually the process of becoming a citizen or living in a different country that has given you a perspective, or learning a language, or your life experiences that contribute to a deep sympathy. I've heard some themes here in our conversations about the sense of empathy of the immigrant experience. I think of Mark Grace, which you shared, of healthcare workers who are experiencing very harsh words spoken to them or overt racism. There's difficulty in our national conversation about undocumented workers and their places in various industries. How do you, in your respective industries, work to help immigrants in this experience of trying to navigate very culturally difficult or maybe even socially hostile environments? It'd be great to hear from a few of you on this.
You know, that's kind of interesting because I was talking about I think on,
are we all back? I'm sorry. I believe we are having technical difficulties. Perhaps I asked a question that was just too hot to handle for Zoom, and this is not a bandwidth issue for you as individuals out there. I think we are actually having a problem with Zoom itself. So I believe we're back on. And let me re-ask the question just in case it may have been missed, and then Mark Grace, you can restart your answer. The question is, each of you have spoken very, very powerfully of your own personal experiences, and you've also spoken with some empathy about the immigrant experience, whether from a personal vantage point or an industry vantage point, and some of the challenges that have been raised for immigrants who are trying to navigate the adjustments that are required in a new country, and sometimes even in a hostile work setting or situation. So how are you helping immigrants in adjustments or rising or dealing with these challenges? And Mark Grace, you were beginning with an answer.
Well, I guess the first obvious thing is representation matters. It matters for people to see. This was a kind of journey we started on a long time ago, at least in the Office of Mission and Ministry. People, you just get a lot more work done a lot more quickly if people can find someone that looks like them, that speaks their language preferably. The healthcare team benefits from all of that expertise and in having culturally informed people who know it from the inside out. The other thing that's a huge problem in EDs is human trafficking, and much of the human trafficking that's happening these days is a result of people being blackmailed and forced into slavery, people who don't have documents, especially with the kind of animus that's been displayed. I often, I was talking to one of our faith community health ministers who is a pastor of a rather large church. He said, you know, one of the thing that we need most desperately are bridge people who can help people in my neighborhood to feel safe to come out of their houses again, to get health care, to ask for police protection. So even if these people putatively were our enemies, we have some obligation to love them.
Thank you. Mark Espinoza, you mentioned in your previous answer that diversity and inclusion is a major initiative at Walmart. And so I suspect that you've thought long and hard about this issue of what does it mean to help the immigrant workers within Walmart. So I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, sir. And yes, internally, we look at it both ways. You look at our associates, and you also look at our customers. Walmart is literally in the business of welcoming, because everybody steps into our stores every day and day in and out. And inclusion is the cornerstone of what our company values. So for our immigrants specifically, we've had some resources that we provide, from naturalization to English language learning. But what I like a little bit more is what we do provide all of our associates would include immigrants. So any efforts that we can be a part of that helps to shape the communities where all people feel safe and valued is very important. So Walmart offers amazing opportunities to mention, and we embrace and encourage diversity of thought and experiences on our teams. And I could take up the rest of the session just talking about some of those, but I want to mention two of them just that are favorite, if you don't mind. The first thing is our academies and Live Better. We have academies and Live Better You. When we take care of our people, we know that they have a unique ability to then create positive impact that strengthens the communities in which they live and work. In recent years, we've invested in our associates, particularly around higher wages, training, and education. Our Live Better You program provides U.S. associates the opportunity to earn a college degree for $1 a day, as well as a high school diploma and digital certificates. Associates of color represent about 47% of our Live Better You participants since the program launched in 2018. We've also built more than 200 in-house training academies that teach retail and management fundamentals and focus on leadership skills. What we want to do is empower them to succeed in the jobs of today and be prepared for the jobs of tomorrow. So you heard me earlier, and Walter, you mentioned it, that we're on a journey towards inclusion. So the next thing, and just briefly I'll talk about, is how we do this externally and how we help people feel belonged. I'm sure I don't need to spell out that the uncertainty of our nation currently faces. We've partnered with the Ad Council and the American Immigration Council on a campaign called Belonging Begins With Us. I know that Donald DeGraff with the Council for Christian Churches and Colleges and Universities also partner on this campaign, which offers a nonpartisan entry point for viewers to connect with what it feels like to be left out and reflect on the ways we cultivate a sense of belonging. So instead of me speaking to it, I think the ad speaks for itself. So let's take a look at the ad.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. If you could see you through my eyes instead of your ego, I believe you'd be surprised to see that you've been blind. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Yeah, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
This has been in the works for more than 2 years, just launched in December of last year, but it's one of the ways we're developing strategies and investing in resources, both internally and externally, to nurture mutual respect and cultivate empathy in the communities we serve.
That is a moving ad. John, agriculture, it's a long, hard day of work. And obviously, lots of discussion has occurred about undocumented workers and the challenges of employment within the agricultural industry. And yet we need this industry to keep us fed. How do you process challenges in which complex issues like documentation exists in the industry?
There is a tremendous amount of challenges. I think it really starts with the mindset of leaders, of owners, of leaders like Mark and others on this phone call that take a holistic view and start with listening. And this goes down to the farm level, but then there's also systemic issues. And so when you think of some of the felt needs of a lot of the immigrants that we have that are, let's say, living in the shadows, as you mentioned, undocumented workers. Well, you know, that's in my mind, just a real injustice of kind of a systemic issue that doesn't get resolved overnight. And oftentimes it results in finger pointing and, oh, it's the president, oh, it's the legislators, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. But the bottom line is that we've had kind of a sign at the border, so to speak, a symbolic sign saying, you know, stay out, it's prohibited to come in. And yet, hey, please come in because we need you. And there's this irony or injustice or whatever you want to call it, but it's this reality that we as a country haven't fixed. And so what encourages my heart, you know, in the agricultural industry is to see growers and others in the industry throughout the supply chain say, you know what, we need to really lock arms here and advocate in a much stronger way at all levels. But then also say, look, you know, here are the laws today. Here's what we're navigating. So let's be attentive to address the fears and the practical needs of workers on a day-to-day basis. And that is an extremely challenging thing. One thing I'll mention too, as far as, you know, addressing practical needs is hugely important. So medical care, you name it. We could talk for hours just on any one specific issue of practical needs that farm workers have. My view is that probably one of the greatest contributions that leaders can make starts with their mindset, as far as these are valued team members. These aren't just, you know, an input like a fertilizer or something like that. No. These are human beings that have potential, that have families, etc. And so when I think of, you know, like these two individuals that I've worked with extensively, one in kind of, you know, former colleague of mine, his name's Manuel. There's two Manuels I'll talk about. Manuel Mercado, who started as a harvester. Today, he's on the board of one of the premier produce companies, a global produce company. And he's just a humble man that worked hard, learned certain skills. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for leaders, you know, farmers that saw potential in this man and didn't view him just as an input like a fertilizer, viewed him as a human being. And today he exercises a tremendous amount of leadership in our industry. Today, one of my colleagues is another Manuel who started as a field worker and today manages thousands of acres. But his mindset, it's not that he just has practical skills to farm, but it's because he exercises leadership across the farm and brings teams together and that type of thing. And so I would caution us to think of just, let's say, we need to give let's say, handouts or this or that to different folks. I think the most powerful concept here is creating opportunities. And that starts with this mindset to say, these are valuable team members that have a lot of potential, and creating opportunities for them.
Thank you. Nancy, I want to turn to you as we draw our time to a close. I have a twofold question. One is the question that we have been discussing and applying it to Silicon Valley. What's happening in Silicon Valley in terms of care for immigrants, immigrant workers, providing assistance. And of course, you just have a very powerful personal narrative of your own experience of citizenship. And I'd love for you just to describe what that process was like for you.
Yeah, so in terms of Silicon Valley, I mean, because we hire people due to the fact that they're highly skilled, we're not, necessarily investing in immigrants in terms of building up their, professional development beyond what we normally do as a company for any employee. And, obviously we have